So my name is Sarah Truby, and I'm a Habitat Conservation Manager with Sky Island Alliance. And today I'm joining you from Tucson, Arizona. And I'm joining you from Tucson, Arizona, where the offices of the Sky Island Alliance sit on the lands of the Tohono O'odham, Pasquayaqui, and other indigenous peoples. My colleague Rick will be pasting the link in the chat to our land acknowledgement if you'd like to learn more about that. We still have a bunch of folks joining, so as folks are joining, feel free to continue sharing your least favorite invasive plant and or where you're joining us from. I see a bunch of folks with Russian thistle, stinknet, yep, lots of that's coming up, buffelgrass, stinknet, some folks joining from Phoenix who are very much anti-stinknet. Me too. I agree with that one. Very nice. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dan Beckman. Dan is a botanist out at Saguaro National Park. If you're active on iNaturalist in the region, he's probably identified some of your more unique plants. In any case, Dan will discuss the most concerning invasive plants here in Arizona and what local organizations are doing to tackle these threats. He'll also help us understand how to identify some of these plants, so when we are out spring seeking, we can do a better job of understanding where these plants are on the landscape. As a reminder, throughout the talk, please remain muted and feel free to type questions into the chat, and we will get to those at the end. So I'd like to pass it off to Dan to take it away.
All right. Share the screen. All right. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, my name is Dan Beckman. I actually came to Tucson in 2013 for a internship at Saguaro National Park to spray buffelgrass. And I didn't know the region at all at the time, but getting out of the landscape to kill buffelgrass and a lot of amazing rugged areas of Saguaro National Park was an opportunity for me to learn the native plants as I went along. And I really fell in love with the native flora here and have been at the park for 10 years, spraying buffelgrass every summer, but also just learning the native plant diversity here more and more. So I come from a perspective of really loving the native plants and observing a lot of invasive plants and thinking a lot about what are the biggest threats to our amazing native biodiversity and what can we do about it. So that's going to be my talk today, and a lot of ground to cover, so I will jump right into it. And these are, as probably a lot of you know, this is buffelgrass featured in these first two slides, some of the really disturbing dense stands that we see in the park. So a quick outline of the talk, just going to go through some invasive plant terminology, broadly why they matter, how they get here via various mechanisms, some big picture concepts for managing invasive plants, and then I'm going to go into some of those specific local threats, some of the species that I think rate really highly in terms of problems and threats on the landscape, and then what we can do to protect the landscapes that we love and battle these very tricky invasive plants. So going into some key terms, you'll often hear non-native species and invasive species used interchangeably. It's not exactly the same thing. So a non-native species is a broader term for any species living outside of its native range, something that arrived because of humans, something that did not evolve with the native flora in place. And other words you'll hear for that are maybe a little outdated. You'll hear exotic, you'll hear alien. Introduced is one that is still in pretty common use. That's another synonym for non-native. An invasive species is a specific subset of non-native species. And this is a non-native species that has been identified as doing some kind of significant harm, whether that be ecological, economic, or there's probably other categories that people use for that. Naturalized is another term you'll hear, and that just refers to when a non-native species is established on the landscape and is able to propagate on its own. It doesn't need human intervention anymore. So this is going to be the case for really any problematic invasive species in the ecological sense. It is propagating on its own. Some more key terms. Weeds is a very broad term you'll hear a lot. A weed doesn't have a very strict definition. It's just a plant growing where it's not wanted. So, that depends on your perspective. If you're a gardener, if you're a rancher, if you're a land manager, you might have a different criteria for what makes a weed. A noxious weed is a legal designation that some kind of government body makes for what they consider high priority pest species that threaten various areas of our society, including the natural ecology. So those are often subject to government regulations. Controversially, they can include native species because, as you see, the natural ecology is not the only consideration that goes into noxious weed lists. But in Arizona, at least, species on this list, which include some of the species I'm going to highlight, should not be sold or imported in the state. They can qualify for funding, for control, and some of those other bullet points I have down there. They are subject to some enforceable regulations, which does help if you're trying to collaborate with governing bodies to control something. This is a question that comes up a lot when we're talking about these definitions. Can a native species be invasive? I've got a couple here that I have heard debate about. Cattails, which are native here, desert broom, which is very common and native here. Some people describe these species as invasive because they do take advantage of disturbed habitats, especially in human-caused disturbance. Given those those definitions I discussed, for invasive species, we're really just talking about non-native species, and I definitely don't think that these native species should be considered invasive. They might be taking advantage of human disturbance, but these are species that evolved on the local landscape with the whole native flora, and they're not going to be a problem like these newcomers can be. Then zooming back, the broad question of, why do invasive plants matter? And for me, this goes hand in hand with the question of, why do native plant communities matter? Why do we care about where a plant came from? Native plant communities have co-evolved over a very long time frame, and over that really long span of natural history have developed checks and balances on each other where all these different species can thrive together. For an example, the Sonoran Desert is estimated to be about 8 million years old, at least in terms of a kind of early proto version of the Sonoran Desert. And that's actually a relatively young biome when we're talking about natural history. So it's important to keep these really huge timescales in mind because they often are tough for humans to comprehend. So over that long period of time, these plant communities have co-evolved, of course, with all the other native biota, with animals, fungi, etc., and have formed these unique relationships with each other. Non-native species that kind of arrive very suddenly often do not have any of those checks and balances and pose a really new scenario for the ecosystem. Sometimes in response to this, you'll hear the question, but aren't landscapes changing all the time? Ecosystems are dynamic. And it's true that ecosystems are dynamic, and we're not trying to, make a freeze frame of a certain landscape that we really like. But for me, this is very similar to a kind of classic climate change denial question of, isn't the climate changing all the time? And, in both cases, it's a yes, but kind of answer. Change is, part of the world, but an invasive plant introduces a rate of change that is very out of whack with natural evolution, which is a really slow process. And of course, our modern world with globalization and industrialization have allowed species to move at a rate that is really unprecedented when you think of the scale of natural history. So it is a unique challenge and a unique threat. But getting into some specific concerns with invasive plants, one of the obvious ones is a loss of native plant diversity. If invasive can outcompete the native plants in the area, you will lose a lot of that diversity. So we see this in the buffelgrass image here, where other than that lone saguaro, it's pretty tough to pick out any native plants in that landscape, in that kind of now buffelgrass savanna. This has all kinds of effects on wildlife and the other native biota, including usually much poorer forage, unsuitable forage for herbivores, messed up pollinator relationships, and just changing the landscape and ruining that landscape integrity, with fire being a really big example where these invasives can introduce fire to landscapes that are not adapted to fire, which is an existential change to the ecosystem. We also want to think about cultural landscapes. These landscapes have also been in relationship to people for millennia and are held sacred. And that's a really huge existential change as well when you transform these landscapes overnight. And then some of the, behind the scenes things like nutrient cycling, erosion control that a native landscape does that might be thrown out of whack by invasive plants. Now I'm going to get into a few major ways that invasive plants arrive here. So one of the big ones is intentional introductions, and in the Southwest, often for livestock forage and or erosion control. So this is the case for a lot of the really problematic grasses that we have here, including buffelgrass. A major era for this was the 1930s and 40s. The USDA Soil Conservation Service was trying to problem solve in terms of controlling erosion and restoring grazing areas. Of course, they did not fully think that out. And some of these species have become huge problems in the wild landscape. There's also been, in more recent times, subsidies given by the Mexican government to convert desert scrub and thorn scrub into buffelgrass pasture, which is looking at economic potential, but obviously a big problem for the native landscape. Another big category here is landscaping. So plants that are brought because they look pretty or people like around their yards, but that then are able to escape and naturalize on the wild landscape. So I've got fountain grass there, which is a really key example locally. And paradoxically, a move towards more water efficient xeriscaping or desert scaping as a landscaping principle is great for water usage, but can actually be more of a problem when we're thinking of invasive plants, because it can really push landscapers towards these super drought and heat adapted plants that nonetheless are not from here and can escape and wreak havoc on the landscape. The third major category I have here are accidental introductions. So this is kind of a catch-all of we don't exactly know where it came from. This applies to a lot of our annual species, not exclusively, but there's so much movement of materials, of people, and seeds can hitchhike on tires, on so many things, and end up somewhere that they should not be. So stinknet is a really big local example. Also soft feather pappus grass, which I featured here, was a relatively recent arrival, really in like the last couple decades, and has already exploded on the landscape, as you can see there. Some major vectors are construction fill, interstate travel, and hikers, especially boots, which is why things like boot brushes are important for trying to remove those seeds before you move into a different area. So now getting into some major concepts of invasive management. this is what is known as the invasion curve. So this graphic is just showing the idea that there's these lag times after a species arrives in a place before it's actually detected, and then an additional lag before people become aware of the problem. And the tricky thing with invasives is that it often does follow this pattern of kind of a slow ramp up. Maybe it's pretty subtle in the early going, but it hits at some point an inflection point where it just spreads in an exponential manner. And this is often around the time where land managers or the public become aware of the problem, and it can very quickly get out of control to a point where eradicating that species is no longer possible, and you're basically once again in a place of damage control and just thinking about, how can we manage this problem locally. I've got another version of the same curve. I like this one because it points out that inflection point there where we hit a very troubling point of runaway spread and runaway cost. So if you don't catch this stuff early, it can quickly become something that is really beyond our capacity to control. And at that point, it's damage control, it's mitigation. So given this concept, the number one goal of invasive plant management is early detection, rapid response. You'll hear the acronym EDRR for this. And I'm highlighting there a couple citizen science tools that members of the public and land managers can use to map and track these species, which, information is just gold for this stuff. If we can get an idea of what these early arriving species are doing before we get to that runaway cost, runaway spread point, then we might have a fighting chance to do something and nip these problems in the bud. So EdMaps is an app that is specifically for mapping these early detection invasive species. iNaturalist, of course, is a general biodiversity mapping tool, but it is also a great way to map these species. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I did just want to point out that there's so many invasive plants on the landscape that a lot of the game in terms of thinking about what to do is evaluating all these species in terms of the unique threats they pose and how you prioritize the kind of overwhelming numbers of plants you see on the landscape. So some of the questions that I think about with this is, how far along is the invasion? Where are we on that invasion curve? How long has it been in this place? And I'm shouting out old publications and floras are actually great for getting that historical perspective. Looking at this 1987 flora of the Rincons, I can see that a lot of our most widespread invasive plants back in the early 80s were not present at all in the landscape. So that really gives you some context for the rate of spread and the timeline. Then just thinking about how serious this threat is, to what extent do we even know that yet? What is the species doing in its native habitat, which might give us some clues about what its potential could be here? And then how does that threat level compare to invasive battles that we're already invested in? And do we have resources to take on another battle? And, where does it rate in the grand scheme of things? So these are difficult questions.
Hey folks, sorry, looks like we lost Dan there. Are you back?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you now. We lost your
Okay.
slides too.
All right. I will share those again.
The gremlins of the internet today for sure.
Mm-hmm. Are we back now?
Yeah, that looks good. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Um, so now I'm moving into the individual species that I'm highlighting, the local species, starting with the poster child that I think most of us are familiar with, buffelgrass, which is native to Africa, Southern Europe, and Southern Asia. It was introduced in the 30s and 40s for erosion control and forage in Arizona and Texas. I think a little bit later in Sonora, but I wasn't exactly sure with what I was finding in my research. Um, in recent decades, the Mexican government was still subsidizing land conversion of desert and thorn scrub into buffelgrass pasture to make it, productive grazing areas, which is very troubling in terms of the ecological impact down there. This plant has a very aggressive spread into wild, undisturbed desert areas. It is extremely heat and drought tolerant. So in the park, we especially see on these rugged south-facing slopes, it can really dominate and fill in these gaps of desert habitat. Of course, those are also very difficult areas to get into to treat. It poses a severe fire threat for the non-adapted desert ecosystem. As you can see in that photo, it fills in the natural gaps of desert habitat with really thick biomass that when it dries out is just perfect fuel for large fires. It burns particularly hot, this species, so the native desert plants really have no chance if a big buffelgrass fire roars through an area. Buffelgrass was first detected in Saguaro National Park in 1989, and it really shows just the insane rate of the invasion that despite some really proactive management efforts, it is still a widespread species that we're still struggling to get a handle on. And buffelgrass is listed as a state of Arizona noxious weed. This is a photo from a helicopter flying over the Rincon Mountains in the park. I just wanted to show this to, I think a lot of people don't realize the scale of what buffelgrass is doing on the landscape. And it is truly daunting when you look at a picture like this. All of that yellowish, dormant, kind of straw colored material between the saguaros and native plants is buffelgrass. So it's really forming a thick carpet across the ridge. And, that knowing that area that extends for more slopes and across that south facing ridge. So getting just some really basic idea on buffelgrass. It is a perennial bunch grass. It's bushy and messy, kind of has an unkempt appearance. It can get pretty big. When it's got fresh green leaf material, it's a very bright lime green shade that I would say is in contrast to most of the other grasses on the landscape, especially the native grasses. When it's flowering, it's got this purplish, pinkish, bottle brush shaped seed head. And as those seeds fall off, it leaves a rough zigzag seed stalk, also known as a rachis, which is one way you can identify it when those seeds have fallen off. Arizona cotton top is a sort of similar native species in terms of the bushy, messy growth form. Bristle grasses are also somewhat similar in that cylindrical spike, bottle brush shaped seed head, but not the same zigzag seed stalk. Now moving right along to its close relative, fountain grass, same genus, native to Africa and the Middle East. This came in a different way, similar time frame though. Was cultivated starting in Tucson around 1940 as a very popular ornamental plant. In recent decades, especially, it has aggressively spread into wild desert riparian areas. So this definitely needs more water than buffelgrass, but it does some of the similar things along waterways. It can create these dense stands that themselves become a fire threat, and in conjunction with buffelgrass on the neighboring slopes, can just carry fire an even greater distance. And this was finally in 2020 listed as an Arizona noxious weed, which is a very important development. Some basic ID stuff. This is a very large, tall growing perennial bunch grass. It gets really, really big. Unlike buffelgrass, the stems are pretty straight, so it doesn't have that really messy appearance. The leaves are wispy. They're also bright green. It has a similar seed head, that big purplish, pinkish bottle brush. It's larger than buffelgrass. For shorthand, I often describe fountain grass as buffelgrass on steroids. The seed head and the whole plant can get bigger. The naked seed stalk is not as clearly zigzag as buffelgrass, but it does have a subtle zigzag to it. Deergrass is the most similar native species just in terms of that robust growth habit and where it grows. I also wanted to highlight red brome, which is very widespread and has been here for a very long time, is still a really big fire threat. So this is native to the Mediterranean region. It's been in North America since the 19th century. This is a winter, spring annual that, like a lot of these species, operates on kind of a boom bust cycle and can have these boom years during particularly wet winters. And you see kind of the carpets that it can form in those conditions. When you get a really wet winter and huge carpets of this forming in the landscape, if it's then followed by a hot and dry summer, perhaps a delayed monsoon, that's all going to dry out and just create huge fuel loads for fire. So this is a really major igniter of fire in the area. And it's a versatile species. You know, it can be found deserts, grasslands, up into oak, juniper, woodlands. Another one I wanted to highlight, just because it's so dominant on the landscape, is Lehman's lovegrass. This was planted for forage in that 1940s period by the USDA. It's a pretty wiry perennial grass, nondescript in a lot of ways, thin leaves. You can see its seed head has tree-like branching with pretty small seeds. But if you spend time in our local desert grasslands, you'll know this one. This is arguably the dominant species locally in grasslands. And, this is, I would consider this well beyond the point of control efforts. But I think it's important to point out because, I think about how much diversity has already been lost from these areas. You see native species hanging on in between these large stands of Lehman's lovegrass, but it has definitely displaced a lot of native species. And like the red brome, an extremely versatile species habitat-wise. And this photo, I believe, is from the Big Bend area of Texas, but you'll see similar scenes going east on I-10 from Tucson. Just an example of an endless sea of Lehman's lovegrass. Next is yellow blue stem. This is a weird and troubling one that seems to be taking off, or seems like it has taken off a lot more in recent years, or at least is getting the attention of land managers more. This was introduced to the Great Plains in the early 20th century, but did not have much of a presence in this area for quite a long time. I was not able to find many records pre-1980. There was this really interesting record from 1952 at the top of Mount Lemmon, where you can still see it today. In recent years, it seems to have spread at an alarming rate. And this is one that is also just quite versatile. And I think one of the troubling parts of it is that its full habitat potential is maybe still unknown in our area because it seems to be gaining ground like as we speak. I've seen it along good waterways and roadsides at all elevation levels, from desert areas to the Sky Island mountaintops. This was declared an Arizona noxious weed in 2020. This is a photo that my coworker took on one of our surveys in Tanque Verde Canyon. upstream of the popular Pools Falls area. And this is just really troubling, seeing this sea of yellow blue stem in the drainage bottom. So some basic ID for this, it is another wiry perennial bunch grass. In rocky areas, I often see the leaves pretty concentrated to the base of the plant, and they dry a kind of reddish coppery color. The most distinctive ID character is that reddish fan-shaped seed head, which you see in the top photo. Kind of those branches looking like very slender reddish fingers. There's a number of native species that are native blue stems that are a bit confusing. So there's a lot to learn there. But in terms of a perennial bunch grass with that reddish fan-shaped seed head, the yellow blue stem is pretty unique locally. All right, moving into another big one that folks are probably familiar with, tamarisk, aka salt cedar. I'm talking here about the shrubby, thicket-forming species, not the athol trees that are really large. These were introduced to Western North America in the mid-19th century for erosion control and windbreaks. This has become the #1 invasive species in desert riparian areas throughout the Southwest region. Very prolific cedar. Its seeds can carry very far via wind and water. It can also reproduce vegetatively from root fragments. It does need a lot of water to germinate, so it really thrives in these major waterways, but it's very good at waiting out dry spells. So it's pretty opportunistic compared to native riparian species, where it can germinate just about any time of year if there's a flood event. It's very well established now. Lot written about the ecological damage it has done to our local waterways. Takes up a lot of water. It also changes soil chemistry by exuding salts, hence the salt cedar name. And this is another Arizona noxious weed. So yeah, these plants are shrubby, thicket forming. The athol tree is also a tamarisk. It is a less invasive form. These are the really huge shade trees that you've maybe seen around town, but they don't propagate as easily as this shrubby form of it. So for ID, you're looking at red stems, you're looking at scaly leaves, these spikes of tiny whitish, pinkish flowers. The native species you're probably most likely to confuse it for are juniper saplings. And there's a lot of controversy about what to do about this problem because it's so widespread in the region. And it's important to point out that rivers in our region have already been decimated in other major ways by groundwater pumping, by dams. And there is a lot of discussion among ecologists of, is that really the root cause that, laid out the red carpet for tamarisk to take over? And of course, I think both are a problem, but certainly generally restoring river systems would probably help take out tamarisk's ability to outcompete in some ways. There's also been experimentation with a biocontrol for tamarisk with a beetle that heavily predates on it. But this is also controversial down here because tamarisk in these degraded river systems is often the only remaining habitat for the endangered southwestern willow flycatcher. So yeah, there's a lot of questions about what to do about tamarisk. Silver senna is one more that I wanted to highlight because I see this as an emerging early detection target species. This has another landscaping plant that is still very popular. It is native to Australia, but it has recently been documented spreading into wild areas. And I have seen it in the rincons going into remote rocky slopes that are pretty far from trails or roads, which I see as very concerning because it is somehow dispersing long distances and is then able to establish pretty easily, it would seem, in the wild habitat. Um, this, I think, would make a good candidate for noxious weed listing, but would likely be an uphill battle with how popular it currently is in the landscaping industry. For ID, this is a pea shrub with feathery, deeply lobed leaves, pretty yellow flowers, followed by green bean pods. There's multiple varieties of this around town, which look a little bit different, but those kind of broad ID traits do carry over. Here's a photo I took on a ridge above Tancaverde Canyon, where I was unpleasantly surprised to see a clump of about 20 plants just randomly up on this ridgetop that had established. Going to end here with a very timely one, and one that we're really actively strategizing against: stinknet, which you might also know as globe chamomile. This is an annual in the sunflower family, which is native to southern Africa. This is one of those sort of unknown, mysterious introductions. The first record of it in the US was in Southern California in 1981. It wasn't detected in Arizona until 1997. But in the past 5 or so years, especially, it has really taken off in a disturbing way. Extremely adapted to hot desert environments, seems to do very well in the Sonoran Desert. Like the red brome, this is kind of operating on that boom bust cycle with wet winters. So in really wet years, like perhaps we're ramping up towards having here this year, you can get a lot of this germinating. It has already thoroughly invaded the Phoenix metro area, displacing the native spring wildflower communities in a way that seems like it's already at that unmanageable point in the invasion curve. In Tucson, it is present, but it is very limited in comparison to Phoenix. And there's been a lot of coordinated community effort to try and keep it like that and stamp it out. But it is definitely a formidable invasive foe. I did see that it's been confirmed in Sonora. I saw a record from Hermosillo on SciNet. I would be curious to know about its full current distribution down there as well. This has all kinds of unsavory characteristics. It is also a major fire threat, and it has this oil on the foliage that creates a particularly caustic smoke that irritates people's lungs. This was added to the Arizona noxious weed list in 2020. And this is an amazing and really disturbing drone photo by a photojournalist of Cave Creek, Arizona, in Maricopa County. And that yellow carpet, that is just a huge stinknet invasion from last spring, when again we had a wet winter that created the conditions for just insane spread of stinknet. For ID, again, this is an annual species that appears in the spring. It has these oily, succulent, carrot-like leaves that are intricately lobed, kind of three-dimensional, as you can see in that close-up. Those oils also irritate some folks' skin, so it's recommended that you use gloves when you're removing this. The mature plants especially emit a very foul odor, hence the stinknet name. The flower head is this very small, bright yellow ball of tiny flowers, and each of those flower heads can have hundreds of individual flowers that each produce a seed. And the math of this is scary when you think about how many seeds are on one little flower head, and then a big mature plant can have hundreds of seed heads. So this is why it's such a good invader. Couple species there: pineapple weed, prickly leaf, aka dogweed, that are good to learn, that look somewhat similar to stinknet. I wanted to shout out, this is a great photo collage by Sue Rutman that is a really good identification guide for stinknet. And she's got a bunch of these on the Arizona Native Plant Society website for both native and invasive plants, and they're just amazing resources. She does a really good job with these. So getting in now into what can we do about invasive plants? For professionals, depending on your field of work, there's a lot of stuff that you can do to be an advocate for fighting invasive plants. So for land managers, obviously, researching and evaluating the threats in your area and then thinking about strategically how we can plan to treat invasive plants. For a lot of industries that work outside, including construction, transportation, agriculture, et cetera, thinking about proper vehicle and equipment cleaning, trying to not make your workplace a vector of the spread of invasive species, thinking about where you're going, where you're sourcing materials from. Weed-free hay is a great thing that folks can do to try and halt the unintentional spread of invasive species. And for education and nonprofits, we just need a lot more public education about these plants and what we can do as a community together to fight them. So for treatment options, there's three major categories that I could think of. I'm familiar with the first two, not so much with biocontrol. The first one is probably the most obvious, mechanical treatment, which is just pulling, digging, disposing of the plant directly. There's pros and cons to all of these treatment options. So for mechanical, it's a pretty simple option. It's clean in terms of you're not dealing with chemicals. It's accessible for a lot of people. You can often do this year round as long as the plant is in the ground. And it's really great for outreach for these public events. It's a great way for people to get involved and learn about the threat. Some negatives of this is a lot of ground disturbance of the soil. You don't want to be doing this in archaeological sites because you could be digging up artifacts and disturbing important sites that way. It also is pretty inefficient for large infestations like some of the buffelgrass we see in the park. Chemical treatment includes directly spraying the leaves in highly disturbed areas, putting pre-emergent down to inhibit germination of seeds, and various woody treatments, which involve cutting trees and shrubs and getting chemical into the cambium to kill it directly. Some positives here is that it can be efficient on a larger scale. You're not tearing up a bunch of soil. The negatives are, I think, pretty obvious here. Health and safety concerns dealing with chemical, and that includes the handlers, the environment, and the community. Chemical treatment also, certainly for buffelgrass, is only effective seasonally when the plant is actually green. Biocontrol, I don't know a lot about, but just to briefly mention it, if we're able to establish a really effective specific predator on a target species, it can be cheap, effective, and passive, but it's really hard to predict what nature is going to do. So those unforeseen consequences are a major concern with biocontrols. And here's a photo of what we do in the park. This is kind of a typical day for a buffelgrass spray crew in the summer, lining out and attacking these big patches of buffelgrass that are really hard to pull by hand and often getting into pretty remote, rugged hillsides to spray these large pseudo-monocultures. Here's an example of a volunteer pull event where folks are pulling fountain grass in the park. You can see a nice before after there. There's been a lot of great work on fountain grass recently. And I want to mention that ideally in the park, what we're going for is chemical and mechanical methods of control complementing each other. So we're doing this with fountain grass right now, where we have events to remove a bunch of big plants from drainages. And then folks with sprayers can come in afterwards and pick off seedlings that are coming up. And many cycles of this is necessary to really exhaust the seed bank. So methods working together is really our best option with these very widespread problems. And anyone can get involved in this fight. So thinking locally, you can start with treating on your own property with pulling up really problematic plants. You can advocate in your community or your neighborhood, get neighborhood events going and initiatives to remove problem species. Mapping and documenting species is so important. I just can't stress this enough. We need eyes everywhere of where these species are popping up. And I already mentioned iNaturalist and EdMaps. For stinknet especially, we've got stinknet.org for Southern Arizona, where we can map and quickly respond to stinknet infestations. You can join volunteer events or groups, and perfect right now, February is Save Our Saguaros month, where we've got a lot of public events that you can join on to pull buffelgrass, to learn more about invasive plants. And of course, just taking responsibility yourself for trying not to spread invasives yourself by cleaning your gear, your boots, etc., as you're traveling. Now, this is my special shout out to help us this spring with mapping and killing stinknet. It's shaping up to be probably a pretty big spring for stinknet. This is a map on stinknet.org. That QR code I can share in the chat, or you should be seeing on materials in the coming months. That's going to link to a Survey 123 form, where if you run into stinknet somewhere, you can take some basic data on it. So we know about it. You can go ahead and pull it if you know that it's stinknet. And we just need all the input we possibly can get from the community on this fight, because we are in that early detection rapid response phase with stinknet, and we need everyone's help because it is a bad one, as we can see from what it's doing up around Phoenix. And that's all I've got, ending with a happy buffelgrass pull photo from the park there. And I will stop sharing my screen so we can open up for hopefully a couple questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Dan. That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful and also somewhat horrifying discussion of invasive species. We do have a couple of questions that already popped up, but for anyone else who has questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll go ahead and get started with the ones that we've already gotten. One person asked actually about buffelgrass after the Bighorn fire, and there was some discussion back and forth about the elevation of the Bighorn fire and whether there was a lot of buffelgrass involved in that. But maybe you could just broadly talk about if there is a fire that buffelgrass, it moves through a buffelgrass area, then what happens after that to the buffelgrass populations?
Yeah, so buffelgrass was definitely one of the major origins of the Bighorn fire. It might have, I don't know exactly, it might have started from multiple points, but certainly that early spread in the lower slopes of the Front Range of the Catalinas, buffelgrass was the fuel for a lot of that early spread. And yeah, the unfortunate thing is that buffelgrass thrives post-fire. So unlike the desert, the grass is very adapted to fire. So it's just going to come up stronger after that fire. So I don't know as much about what's going on the ground in terms of if folks are looking at restoring those areas, but yeah, something like that is the worst case scenario that we're managing to try and avoid. But it's so widespread that it's tough. I mean, it is, those kind of fires are an inevitability in some ways that we're trying to mitigate for.
Gotcha. Yeah. Someone else asked if you could recommend a good resource for locating large stands of these invasive plants if someone wanted to go and see one so that they could become more familiar with it in the field.
I would probably recommend looking up volunteer groups that are already working on this. Certainly can get in touch with me or Frankie Foley at the park about getting involved in stuff in Saguaro National Park, but there's also the Tucson Weed Whackers. I think getting involved in like a Save Our Saguaros month event could probably connect you, because yeah, I think with these big patches, they're best tackled with a group of people. And but yeah, if you're curious, also just looking on iNaturalist, you can get an idea of kind of where.
Oh, Dan might have frozen again. But or maybe I'm frozen. Okay, thanks, thanks, Sammy. So it is Dan who's frozen. Well, I think he was going to say iNaturalist is a great tool that that you can look online to see where particular plants already are. Oh, good, Dan's back. Great, cool.
I saw that Perry Grissom shared a link about the bighorn fire and buffelgrass,
Yes,
which I encourage you to check out.
very cool. Yeah, we had a couple more questions. So one was, is there any hope that adequate federal funding will become available for addressing the most problematic non-native plants on federal lands? Do you have any ear to what's going on in the larger picture, and if there's any more funding coming down the pipeline?
Um, that's a little above my pay grade, honestly. I if Perry or anyone else who has been involved in getting funding wants to chime in, please do so. Um, yeah, I mean that those noxious weed listings for fountain grass and stinknet are encouraging in that that gives us a little more of a leg to stand on in terms of seeking out funding. Um, One of my supervisors, Don Swan, has been able to get a really nice grant for tackling fountain grass in the park. And that was through like creative partnerships with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, um, as well as help from our nonprofit partner. Um, yeah, I think kind of at the park, we've had some success getting money from fuels funding for fire, and I think framing it as a fire threat, as a public safety threat for buffelgrass and fountain grass, I think can be one of the more effective ways of getting funding.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. We had one more question. This one from Eamon about, is Wilman lovegrass or Agrostis superba considered much of a problem? Because we've been seeing large swaths of it in the San Rafael Valley in particular.
Um, that I'm not totally sure because that, as far as I know, doesn't get north of I-10, so I don't have direct experience with it. But that's probably an example of one. If you're seeing it more and more commonly, that could be another good early detection target that you want to map more and research. I'm aware of that one. I know it's got a very unique look, which is helpful, but I don't know as much about um, the kind of ecological threat it might pose, or even, yeah, I'd be curious how long it has been known in the area. But yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, I just want to thank you again, Dan, and I want to let everybody else know who attended. If you missed any part of this, the recording will be up on our website. You're welcome to. Oh, just kidding. We have one more question. We'll do one more question, and then we'll do the
Okay.
wrap up. So Sammy asks, am I right in thinking that the Southern Arizona EDRR group prefers EdMaps for most things other than stinknet? Or maybe are there other tools to be tracking some of these invasives?
Um, yeah, so I've just recently gotten involved with the Southern Arizona EDRR group. So my impression is that EdMaps is sort of what folks are trying to move mapping towards for most species, and I don't think all of us are quite in the habit of that yet locally. But the thinking there is that trying to get something where, you know, nationally at least everyone can be on the same page and kind of feeding into one system that we're all working from. So yeah, I think eventually that's where we want to go. For stinknet right now, we're doing stinknet.org, but iNaturalist is also a fine place to use. Data can move between those systems. Um, but yeah, I'd say stay tuned on EdMaps because that seems to be the future.
Makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, and also I do want to comment. All the chat and the discussion in the chat has been really great. A lot of people helping each other out and answering questions, which has been fantastic. But yeah,
Yeah,
so if you if you missed any part of
very
this
active.
talk, yeah, people are very they care a lot about invasive species, which is awesome.
Mhm.
But if you missed any part of it, the recording will be up on our website, and you can rewatch any of our coffee breaks. Actually, Rick has that link and can paste it into the chat for us. We also have Scott Island Alliance has a large number of events coming up, including we are launching an invasive species removal project at springs around Tucson, and that's coming up this spring and the rest of this year. So we're ramping that up soon. So keep an eye on our website and our newsletter to find those events, especially if you were inspired by Dan's talk and you want to go out and start removing invasives immediately. But I do hope that you will join me one more time in thanking Dan for this talk and for his excellent work tackling invasive species for the last decade. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and for your interest in working together on this.
I love it. Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.